Hi everyone. In this short video, we're going to talk about the communication cycle and the elements that are involved in the communication process. So first, let's talk about the purpose. Communication has to be understood that it is in fact a process. It is a continuous process. If you look over in the figure here to the right, you'll notice that there are different elements. We have a sender who creates and transmits the message. Then we have a receiver that receives the message. Then that receiver interprets the message and provides feedback to the sender. So as you can see from looking at this figure, it is continuous and ongoing. We should always think of our communication as a whole and not only about ourselves or our messages. We want to make sure we consider all of the different elements involved in communication. So what exactly is communication? Well, according to Merriam-Webster, it's defined as a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior. And Merriam-Webster also says that it is a personal rapport. The English word communication is actually derived from a Latin word meaning, or communis, meaning common. Communication is the common understanding between minds and hearts. So in short, communication is the sending and receiving of messages. We may not always be aware of the message that we are either sending or receiving, but we need to know that we are always sending and receiving them. Communication can be a complex action, and it does require the participation of two or more people. So, for example, it could just be a face-to-face interaction between two people, or it could even occur just like in this video. I'm the sender and you guys are the receiver, so it can be an audience of people as well. So let's talk about the communication cycle. There are 5 basic elements involved in the communication cycle. They are the sender, message, the transmission or the mode in which you transfer that message to the next element, which is our receiver. And then remember, our receiver interprets that message and then provides the feedback. So those are the 5 basic elements involved in communication. Let's talk about each one of those a little bit further. So the sender actually begins the communication cycle. They do this by creating the message. They know what it is they want to say. They know what idea they want to convey. So it all starts with the sender. This person is responsible for creating a clear thought to send. It can be a verbal thought. It can be nonverbal communication. It could even be written communication. And we'll talk about that in just a minute too. So the sender must be very aware that they're choosing words carefully. They want to be able to send the most clear, concise message to the receiver as possible to avoid any confusion. Another very important thing to remember is when we are the sender, we must know our audience. So what do I mean by that? Well, we need to know who we're talking to. Who are we communicating with? Who are we sending the message to? So, for example, if you're talking to a child, you're going to use a certain language. However, if you're talking to an adult or maybe an older adult, you're not going to use the same language as you would talking to a child. Or let's talk about in the professional setting. If we're talking to a patient, we're going to talk to the patient using different words than we would if we were talking to a healthcare professional. You wouldn't talk to a patient using medical jargon or medical terminology. Instead, you would take those medical terms or take that medical jargon and break it down into layman's terms so that the patient or your audience can understand. Another factor is age groups. We have to look and see what age groups we're going to be talking to. So let's take a group of teenagers or adolescents. They have their own verbiage. They have their own language sometimes. So again, I'll relate it back to the older adults, and we wouldn't use that same verbiage talking to them as we would talking to our adolescents. We also need to think about our audience's culture or their language that they're using. If we don't take all of these things into consideration, then we run the risk of our messages being misunderstood. So every type of communication is based on the sender, because we said the sender is the communicator. So as a sender, we know what message or idea we want to convey or say. We need to be aware of our receiver. Remember, we were talking about knowing your audience. We need to be aware of who it is that we are going to be communicating with or speaking to so that we can adjust our language accordingly. We want to create a message in the best way that is going to be understood by the receiver. So we talked about the sender, and we say the sender is the one doing the talking. The sender is the one that's creating what is called the message. And the message is the actual content that's going to be communicated. So remember, we said the sender is kind of in charge of this. So the sender chooses the words to send. They choose the medium, or also known as the channel, or the way in which we're going to send those words. For example, remember we said they could be verbal, just like we're doing now, we're speaking, or it could also be written, maybe in an email. Also, part of that medium or channel, we have some nonverbal aspects to consider, such as gestures, hand gestures, or our tone of voice. Or it could even be our use of space, or how much personal space are we allowing? When you're talking to someone that you know on a personal level, you're likely to decrease that personal space with them, and you're likely to be closer to them when you're speaking to them. However, if you're talking to a coworker or someone, maybe just you're in the store shopping and it's a stranger, you're probably going to have more space between the two of you. The message is affected by, like we said, the sender's tone, how the message is presented, also the information that's in the message, and also what information is not in the message. Remember, we said we want our messages to be very clear. So before you ever send a message, you want to make sure that you're including all the important information so that the receiver will be able to understand. So to do that, you need to know what's the purpose of your message. What is it you're wanting to say? What are you wanting to tell them? Is it maybe to promote something? Is it because you're trying to inform them? Are you trying to warn them? Are you trying to educate them? Or are you trying to raise awareness? All of these are going to require different gestures. They're going to require very different tones. If I'm trying to educate you like I am now, my tone's going to be a little different. My facial expressions are going to be a little bit different. However, if I'm trying to warn you about something, notice what happened with my face just there. So we make these nonverbal adjustments to match the purpose of our message. Once you've determined all of this, then you're going to decide, how am I going to deliver this message? That's where transmission comes in. Transmission is how the message is actually going to be sent to that receiver. This is how we get our message basically from point A, the sender, to point B, the receiver. So there are a lot of different ways to do this, especially with all of our technology today. So some ways that we can do these transmissions can include face-to-face encounters, just having a conversation with someone and face to face, or maybe it's by calling them, or maybe it's by email. And then also with our phones, we can do that ever so popular texting. Maybe it's by letters if people write letters anymore, or people do still fax things, reports. And one that's very, very popular right now is video conferencing, using FaceTime, using Zoom. There's all sorts of video conferencing software available that people are utilizing right now, both personally and professionally. You have probably used some yourself. And then another way is by social media, such as Snapchat, Facebook, or even Instagram. So there are, as you can see, so many different ways that you can use to pass your message along to the receiver. And you have to decide which is the best format for the type of message that you're sending, and also the receiver that you're sending it to. So no matter which route you take, the message must include these next three things. One, it needs to be transmitted clearly. Also at an appropriate time. Also with the appropriate mode of transmission, like we were just talking about. So think about this. We talked about all those different modes of transmission. So let's talk about texting. Okay. I know how to text, you know how to text. Everybody pretty much is familiar with texting. I think the younger generations really have a head start on that. They know a lot more about texting even than I do, or maybe some of the older generation does. So texting may not be always the most appropriate mode of transmission, depending on the age of your receiver. Also, texting may not be the most appropriate depending on the type of message that you're sending. What if you are trying to communicate some lab or x-ray results to a patient? Probably are not going to text those. You might want to do a couple of things. You might have a couple of different ways to transmit some messages. Let's think to the ones about the lab results and x-ray results. It may be that you are going to talk to a patient face to face to tell them about their results, or maybe even to educate them on an upcoming procedure. And then in addition to having that face-to-face conversation, you give them something in writing, a written form of communication to take home with them so that they can review it later. So you won't necessarily just have one mode. Sometimes you will have a couple of them. Some instances may be suitable for written communication, just like we were just talking about. However, if there are some pretty serious situations going on, I wouldn't recommend just written communication. And each office has their own protocols as well that you'll need to follow. But there's some information that may need to happen face to face. And then others, like we were just talking about, others may need spoken communication. Some may need both, just like we were just talking about with patient education. Email and video conferencing, like we were saying, are very, very popular right now. And there's probably just going to continue to grow. One example in the healthcare field is teledoc, where a patient can video conference with the provider, like in the picture here on the slide. Another one are patient portals. These are with electronic health records. These are really popular. Many facilities are going to patient portals, where a patient can utilize this portal to schedule an appointment or maybe cancel an appointment, to even simply to ask a question. They can send you a message there, much like a text message. And in addition to, I know even speaking with me, I have received some lab results through the patient portal. But I will say that if some of those lab results, have some things that are critical, then we would not want to simply use the patient portal. We want to ensure that our channel of transmission or our mode of transmission is best matched to our message and also to our audience. So let's talk about our audience. Our audience is known as the receiver. The recipient is the recipient. The receiver is the recipient of the sender's message. He or she must be able to listen to your message if you're speaking to them, or read your message if it's in written form, and they must be able to decode this message by evaluating all of that communication. So when we're talking about verbal communication or speaking just like we are now, the primary skill used here is listening. That's something that I think is undervalued, but it's incredibly important in communication. So as you can see, the receiver does have a responsibility as well if you're speaking one-on-one, and that is to make sure they're listening to you. So you have to keep in mind, if they are listening to you as the sender, what is your tone like? What about your pitch in your voice? Are you talking very loud? Very high? Are you talking really low? Are you mumbling? All of these things carry a meaning. So if I was to come up to you with a very loud voice, kind of like this, how does that make you feel? Do you feel comfortable with that? If we were in a patient exam room, would you feel comfortable with that? Or would it be better if I brought my pitch down some, brought my tone down a little bit? Isn't that just a little more supportive and a little more comforting? So you have to think about those things, because all of these things are evaluated by the receiver. Now, that's verbal communication. So let's talk about written communication from the receiver's standpoint. Written communication also carries a tone that is perceived by the receiver. So think about this. Have you ever received an email or maybe a text message where the message was typed in all capital letters, in all caps, or hey, even if only a portion of that message was in caps? How did that make you feel? What was your first impression? Remember what they say about first impressions. You get one time to make a first impression. What was your first impression of seeing that message? Well, generally, if something is typed in all caps, we perceive that as the receiver as someone is yelling at us. So we need to be mindful of when we type in caps, that is the way that the receiver or the reader is going to interpret that message. Italics also have some weight here, okay? If you notice, even in this slide, I have placed some words in italics because it shows a little emphasis. I really want to draw your attention to those words. Another thing are symbols, okay? Or even emojis. But let's talk about symbols for a minute. I gave an example here of exclamation points. How does that make you feel if you've ever received a text message where someone might put 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 exclamation points behind a sentence? How did you perceive that? Especially if some of those words were capitalized. Then you think to yourself, why are they yelling at me? So these are all things in written communication that you need to be cognizant of, so that you can sit there and think, what? How is the receiver going to interpret this message? So for the message to have meaning, any emphasis made by the sender must be fully understood by the receiver. The sender should be aware of the receiver's attitude and the receiver's perception. Like I was just saying, if you are thinking about a conversation you're going to have with someone, you need to think in advance about how the way that you say it, how it might be perceived by that receiver, or if it's written communication, and when they read it, how is it that they are going to perceive or interpret that information? So as you can see, a large part of the responsibility of how a message is received lies on who? Lies on the sender. It lies on the one that's talking. It lies on the one that's writing. It lies on the one that's presenting. Now, that being said, the receiver also plays a big part. I'll tell you how. So when I say you need to be aware of your receiver's attitude, to explain that just a little bit further, if you know your receiver, think about his or her past experiences, or maybe what the experience or the situation is right now when you're communicating with them. Consider what their emotional state might be, what ideas they may have, or any beliefs that they have. All of these things can influence how that receiver is going to interpret your message. Okay, so we talked about the sender, we talked about the message, we talked about how we're going to get our message from the sender to the receiver. Remember, that's that mode of transmission. That's that channel we were talking about. So that very last element, the fifth element, is called the feedback. And this occurs when the receiver and the sender, both of them, confirm their perception of the message. Feedback can be verbal, as in saying, yes, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I got what you're saying. Or it can be nonverbal. It can be meaning, okay, I got it. Sometimes it can also be both. And also, of course, it can be written as well. So feedback is important because what it does is it tells the sender if the message that they gave was interpreted accurately by the receiver. This is how that sender confirms that, hey, what I said, what I wanted you to know, okay, that's what you understood. So we're good. It also enhances understanding of the message. So it does this by verifying or clarifying any misunderstandings. It might be that you say something. There's been sometimes I've even said it. I even do it sometimes whenever I am talking with students, over content like this, that I will explain something and I can just tell that what I'm saying, that they're just not getting it the way that I'm presenting it. So that is verifying to the sender that there's a misunderstanding there. So I have to kind of go back, regroup, change my approach a little bit, and then explain it in a different way, and then ask for feedback at that point again. And then once the class lets me know, yes, oh, okay, all right, I know what you're talking about now. Now it has clarified to me that there are no further misunderstandings. So feedback should be timely. The sooner the better, so we know our message has been received the way we wanted it to be received. It should be relevant, brief, and to the point. And you want it brief and to the point so that you don't go back to any confusion that you may have already resolved. So, just in summary, what we talked about the communication cycle, and we said that it's a process, right? It's a continuous, it's a repeating process. The sender must be mindful of how his or her message will be perceived. This is done by being cognizant of your tone, being aware of how you're presenting it. What does your body language say? What does your gestures say? What do your facial expressions say? Do they match your words that you're saying? Also, remember, we also need to be sure about the transmission or the mode that we are sending this message. Is it okay for it to be written? Or is it something that's more important that maybe we need to have a face-to-face conversation? Also, be sure to, when you're choosing that mode of transmission, you need to be aware of your audience. Remember, we talked about those different age groups. They may want that face-to-face interaction because they consider that more personable and more supportive. We also must be aware of the message being sent and received. And one thing I really kind of wanted to point out here is to remember that the communication process, it's irreversible. So that's why we always need to be aware of what we're saying and how we're saying it. So just a little final thought here to leave you with. Let's take a look at this quote. Communication, the human connection, is the key to personal and career success. That's by Paul J. Meyer, who is a motivational speaker. And it is very, very true. Communication is something that can take you to the next level, both in your personal and professional lives. So that's why it's so important to learn these communication skills. And they are, in fact, skills. And you know, skills, how do we make our skills better? How do we enhance our skills? By practice. So let's be sure that the message that we're sending is understood, it is effective, and it builds that human connection. Thank you so much for joining me.